As I regained my strength, it was like a veil had lifted. The mysterious illness that had tormented me for so long finally began to lift, as though whatever malevolent force that had been feeding off my suffering had lost interest. We decided to move out of that cursed apartment, hoping to leave behind the nightmares that had haunted me. But I could still feel its lingering presence, a shadow that refused to fully let go. I wouldn't exactly call this a story. It's more of a series of unsettling experiences that have stayed with me. In the town where I live, there's an old abandoned building that once served as a hospital, an orphanage, and later an asylum. For the last stretch of its existence, it was a care home before closing down in 2003. I had heard rumors that it was haunted, but those stories only piqued my curiosity. So naturally, I decided to explore it with a few friends. The first time we went in, it felt eerie, but nothing too alarming happened. I had heard strange noises here and there, and once, I thought I heard a voice. But I brushed it off. It was an old building after all, and old buildings tend to creak and groan. Another time, I went in with a few friends. While most of us were exploring a room in the basement, two of my friends stayed near the entrance. Suddenly, we heard a small bang. They shone their flashlight on the wall where the noise came from, and to our shock, a piece of plaster fell off as if something had struck it from the other side. That was enough to freak everyone out, so we quickly left. But despite those eerie experiences, I decided to go back again. This time, I regretted it deeply. Although I had been inside several times before, I still hadn't explored all of the building. On this occasion, we ventured further, exploring parts we hadn't seen before. We made our way to the old chapel and discovered a hidden set of stairs behind it. We descended into the lower levels, following a series of narrow, dark corridors that twisted through the basement. As we wandered deeper, we came across a very narrow set of stairs leading down to a few small rooms. One of these rooms was incredibly dark and unsettling. My friend Michael turned to Jack and said, "Jack, do you recognize this place?" That's when I realized it. We had stumbled upon the morgue. Michael and Jack had been here before and experienced something strange, which they had briefly mentioned to me. The moment we reached the morgue, I was overcome with a wave of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not supposed to be there. I began tugging on Jack's coat, almost begging him, "Please, can we leave? I don't want to be here. Let's go find Ryan, but I'm not going back alone." The longer we stood there, the more panicked I became. Anxiety was taking over, and it was getting harder to breathe. Jack turned to reassure me, "Just 1 second," and took a step towards the morgue. As he did, I glanced directly into the room. Suddenly, everything around me seemed to close in. My vision narrowed, my head spun, and I felt like I was about to faint. For a moment, I was overwhelmed by an intense sensation, almost as if I had just brushed up against death itself. I had to get out of that building immediately. The moment we left, I felt disoriented and could barely speak properly. That night, I couldn't sleep until the early hours of the morning. Something even stranger happened afterward. I had previously taken a fire exit sign from the building as a souvenir during an earlier visit. But after that night in the morgue, the sign was nowhere to be found in my room. It simply vanished. Lexi, one of my friends, had a similar experience. She felt something pull her back when she was near the morgue and had taken a theater sign from the hospital wing. But just like my sign, hers also disappeared without a trace. The experience that Michael and Jack had shared earlier was equally chilling. They told me that during a previous visit, they had felt an unsettling presence in the morgue, but it wasn't as intense as what I had felt. Still, it was enough to scare them away. On their way out, while they were heading toward a room with a ladder, they called me to share what had happened. As we spoke on the phone, they suddenly heard a loud bang from a nearby room. Then, they saw a shadow move on the opposite side of the building. They quickly hung up, needing both hands to descend the ladder as quickly as possible. Once they were safely out of the building, they called me back and said that while climbing down, they had seen a shadowy figure lurking in the room where they had heard the noise. Another friend of mine had a similar experience in or near the morgue. Although I'm not sure whether he actually stepped inside the room or just looked in from the doorway, he reported feeling the same overwhelming dread that I had. He was so shaken by the experience that he had a full-blown panic attack and refused to speak for the rest of the day. Whatever presence lingers in that morgue clearly does not want anyone intruding on its territory. Apart from the morgue, the rest of the building is fascinating in its own eerie way. It's a shame that so much of it has been vandalized and damaged over the years. Yet it's clear that something is guarding the area around the morgue, warning away any curious souls who dare to venture too close. One of the creepiest parts of the story involves a friend of a friend who had taken photos inside the building. In one of the mirror selfies he took, you can faintly see the outline of what appears to be a small blonde girl, a ghostly figure that others have reportedly seen in the past. There have even been sightings of a nun wandering through the building. Once, while exploring near the chapel, I caught a glimpse of a small shadow moving swiftly across the room. I'm not sure if it was my imagination or something truly paranormal, but the memory still haunts me. After experiencing these terrifying encounters, I became obsessed with trying to uncover the history of the building. I scoured the internet, hoping to find records or stories that could explain the strange phenomena, but there was little information available. The building's dark past remains largely a mystery. Despite everything, these experiences have convinced me that there's something beyond our understanding lurking in that old hospital. If you're into ghost hunting, I would recommend checking it out, but only if you're prepared for what you might encounter. Whatever it is, it's still there, guarding the secrets of the past, waiting for those brave enough or foolish enough to disturb it. I've always loved scaring myself with spooky stories, digging through websites full of ghost photos, and reading tales of the supernatural. Even as a child, I thought I was immune to fear. I believed in ghosts, but I had never truly felt their presence, until one day when that belief was put to the test in a way I'll never forget. It all started when I was 14 years old. I had recently moved to Malmesbury, a small country town nestled between Daylesford and Castlemaine. Growing up in the quiet countryside, there wasn't always much to do, so my friends and I had to get creative when it came to finding entertainment. My best friends Brett, Fern, and I often sought out thrills and challenges, daring each other to venture into abandoned buildings and other spooky places. One day, Brett came up with an idea that sent a shiver down my spine even before we set out. He suggested we explore the old Kyneton hospital, which had been abandoned for years. The building was officially off limits, with fencing around the property, but we had heard rumors about the creepy things that went on inside. There were whispers of strange noises, flickering lights, and even ghosts. I wasn't sure if I believed any of it, but the thought of exploring a haunted hospital was too intriguing to pass up. After school, we made our way to the old hospital. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the crumbling walls. We slipped under a section of the fence where the ground had eroded, letting us crawl through. The front door had been broken down by someone who had been there before us, so we had easy access to the dark, decaying interior. The moment we stepped inside, the temperature seemed to plummet. It felt like we had just walked into a freezer, even though it was the middle of summer. A cold, biting chill surrounded us, and the air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. I shivered, but tried to act brave in front of my friends. To our left, there was a small room, and to our right, what looked like an old reception area. The dim light filtering through the broken windows barely illuminated the dusty, abandoned rooms. As we ventured deeper, we came across a room that was padlocked, and beside it, a long, dark hallway lined with doors to countless other rooms. Something about that hallway felt wrong, like it was hiding something sinister. We didn't dare go down that way. Instead, our eyes were drawn to an old wooden staircase directly in front of us. The staircase looked like it could collapse at any moment. The railing was splintered and rotten, and the steps creaked ominously under our weight. But curiosity got the better of us, so we climbed the stairs cautiously, each step sending a tremor through the old boards. Every creak and groan made me worry we'd fall through the floor, but we pressed on. At the top of the stairs, we found ourselves facing a tiny door, barely a meter high. It was strange and unsettling, like something out of a twisted fairy tale. To our right was another hallway, even darker than the one below, but we were too scared to explore it. Instead, we turned left, where an old sign above the door indicated we were approaching what used to be a surgery room. As we slowly approached the room, taking one cautious step at a time, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. That's when we heard it, footsteps echoing in the empty corridor behind us. We froze in our tracks, too scared to turn around. The sound grew louder, the footsteps drawing closer, but when we finally mustered the courage to look, there was no one there. Just as suddenly as they had begun, the footsteps stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in on all sides. A gust of wind rushed past us, cold and chilling, as if someone, or something, had brushed right by. We held on to each other, squeezing our eyes shut, hoping whatever it was would leave us alone. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the footsteps continued down the hall toward the surgery room, fading into silence. I was done. I wanted to get out of that place immediately, but Brett and Fern convinced me to push on just a little further. They argued that we were so close to the surgery room, how could we turn back now? Reluctantly, not wanting to seem like a coward, I agreed. As we crept closer, a faint but distinct sound reached our ears. It was like the flickering of a dying light bulb, even though we knew there was no electricity running through the old hospital. And then, even more disturbingly, we heard something that sounded like someone performing CPR, heavy breaths and rhythmic compressions, echoing in the darkness. That was the last straw. We looked at each other in sheer terror, our eyes wide with disbelief. Without another word, we turned and bolted down the stairs as fast as we could, the old boards creaking and groaning beneath us. The feeling that something was chasing us didn't leave until we burst out through the front door into the fading daylight. To this day, I've never set foot in that hospital again. The experience was too intense, too real. But the stories about the old Kyneton hospital didn't end with us. Locals in the area still talk about the strange things that happened there. There's a legend about a little boy who was locked in the morgue, and when he was finally let out, he was never the same again. No one knows for sure if the story is true, but it adds to the eerie reputation of the place. Sometimes, I find myself wondering what would have happened if we had ventured deeper into the hospital. What other secrets did that old building hold? But whenever that thought crosses my mind, I remember the footsteps, the freezing cold, and that horrifying feeling that something was watching us. The thought of going back sends chills down my spine. Maybe there are things in this world we aren't meant to understand, things that belong to the shadows, hidden away in places like the old Kyneton Hospital, where the echoes of the past refuse to fade away. I've worked as a nurse on the oncology floor at my local hospital for several years, mostly on the night shift. During these quiet hours, the hospital takes on a different life, one that feels eerie and almost otherworldly. Over the years, I've seen patients come and go, witnessed moments of joy and heartbreak, and like many who work in healthcare, have experienced a fair share of unexplainable incidents. But nothing compares to the events that unfolded one particular night that I'll never forget. We had a patient that night who was in the process of what is termed actively dying. For those who may not be familiar, this means that the patient is in the final stages of their life and is not expected to live beyond the next 24 hours. By this point, most patients are usually unconscious and heavily sedated to relieve any remaining pain. The man was a long-term patient in our ward. His family, understandably devoted, had been by his bedside almost continuously for nearly a full day, watching and waiting. The air in the room was heavy with the scent of antiseptic, mingled with the subtle, almost metallic smell that lingers near those who are close to death. You could feel the sadness and tension in the air. The nurse assigned to him was new to the oncology ward, still learning the ropes but genuinely compassionate. She was doing her best to comfort both the patient and his family. After checking his vital signs, she noticed what appeared to be a slight improvement in his condition. His breathing seemed less labored, and his pulse was a bit stronger. Thinking that he might hold on for a little longer, she suggested that the family go home, rest, and return in the morning. They had been awake for nearly 24 hours straight and looked exhausted. They were reluctant, but eventually agreed, hoping to catch a few hours of sleep. They lived about 2 hours away, so they gathered their things and left with promises to return soon. What the new nurse didn't realize was something those of us with more experience on the oncology floor had learned over the years. It's not uncommon for patients to experience a brief rally, an unexpected burst of energy, just hours before death. It's almost as if their bodies summon one final surge of strength before letting go completely. Unfortunately, this brief moment of improvement can be misleading, especially for those unfamiliar with the phenomenon. Not even an hour after the family had left, the patient passed away quietly in his bed. I was one of the first to notice. His labored breathing had stopped, replaced by a stillness that only comes with death. The monitors showed a flat line, and I knew he was gone. The young nurse, realizing her mistake, was devastated. She felt guilty for sending the family away, thinking that they had missed their loved one's final moments because of her advice. But we comforted her, assuring her that these things happen and that no one could have known for sure. What the new nurse didn't realize was something those of us with more experience on the oncology floor had learned over the years. It's not uncommon for patients to experience a brief rally, an unexpected burst of energy, just hours before death. It's almost as if their bodies summon one final surge of strength before letting go completely. Unfortunately, this brief moment of improvement can be misleading, especially for those unfamiliar with the phenomenon. Not even an hour after the family had left, the patient passed away quietly in his bed. I was one of the first to notice. His labored breathing had stopped, replaced by a stillness that only comes with death. The monitors showed a flat line, and I knew he was gone. The young nurse, realizing her mistake, was devastated. She felt guilty for sending the family away, thinking that they had missed their loved one's final moments because of her advice. But we comforted her, assuring her that these things happen and that no one could have known for sure. Then, just as we were about to dismiss it as a malfunction, the call light in the room next door lit up, followed by the one next to it. It was as if someone or something was walking down the hall, pulling the call lights one by one. The lights continued to activate sequentially, moving down the entire hallway toward the east wing. It took just about the same amount of time that it would have taken for a person to walk from one room to the next, entering each room and pulling the light cord. Puzzled, we watched as the lights turned on, one after another, until they reached the end of the hall. Then, to our astonishment, the lights started activating on the opposite side of the hallway, heading back toward the room where the patient had died. We all stood frozen, staring at the hallway, trying to rationalize what we were seeing. The entire sequence had taken only a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, the call light in the deceased man's room lit up again, completing a full circle. At first, we assumed it was some sort of electrical glitch, perhaps caused by a short circuit. But when we checked with the building maintenance crew, they assured us there were no issues with the electrical system. The technician who came to investigate found nothing wrong, shaking his head in confusion as he left. Our resident prankster, a fellow nurse who was known for his practical jokes, happened to walk by the nursing station around that time. Naturally, we all accused him of somehow rigging the lights to scare us. But he insisted he had nothing to do with it, and judging by his genuinely perplexed expression, we believed him. Just as we were starting to relax, thinking it was all over, the lights began to turn on again. The pattern was exactly the same, starting from the deceased man's room, moving down the hall, and circling back. This time, the mood among us shifted from amusement to unease. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that no logical explanation could account for what was happening. We started half jokingly, half seriously talking about the possibility of a restless spirit. The thought was unsettling, especially since the call lights were now interfering with our ability to attend to other patients. After turning off the lights for the third time, I decided to take a different approach. I went into the deceased man's room. The air inside was colder than the rest of the hospital wing, almost like a chill that seeped into your bones. The body had already been taken away, but the room still held an eerie presence. Standing there alone, I spoke softly to the empty room. I told him I was sorry that his family hadn't been able to be with him at the end, and that the nurse had made an honest mistake. I expressed our collective regret for his lonely passing. Then, with a lump in my throat, I asked him to stop playing with the lights because it was affecting our work and causing distress. Finally, I said a quiet prayer, asking for peace for his soul. As I walked out of the room, the air seemed to lighten, almost as if a weight had been lifted. The call lights did not turn on again after that. The rest of the night was quiet, though none of us could shake the feeling that we had just witnessed something beyond our understanding. We exchanged nervous glances, but kept our thoughts to ourselves, unwilling to acknowledge out loud what we were all thinking, that perhaps the patient had not been ready to leave this world just yet and was trying to communicate with us one last time. The next day, when the morning shift came to relieve us, we told them about the strange events. Some were skeptical, dismissing it as exhaustion playing tricks on our minds, while others, especially those who had worked the night shift for years, nodded knowingly. They had their own stories, whispers of shadows that moved without cause, cold spots in certain rooms, and the occasional inexplicable flicker of lights. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I never saw or heard anything directly, but the sequence of events, the timing, and the sudden cessation after I spoke to the spirit all pointed to something beyond mere coincidence. Whether it was truly a ghost or simply a glitch that happened to coincide with a man's passing, I will never know. But one thing is certain. That night reminded me that even in a place as clinical and sterile as a hospital, there are mysteries we may never fully understand.